I am delighted to introduce His Highness Prince Faisal bin Farhan bin Abdullah, Saudi Arabia's Foreign Minister, His Excellency Mohammed Al-Jadaan, Saudi Arabia's Minister of Finance, His Excellency Faisal Al-Ibrahim, Saudi Arabia's Minister of Economy and Planning. Gidi Gopinath is here. She is Deputy Managing Director at the International Monetary Fund, and Akeem Steiner is Administrator at the United Nations Development Programme. Please make them feel welcome. Thank you, Your Highness. So we hope you all enjoy breakfast and enjoy this conversation. We're going to focus on a number of issues, but most importantly, international forums like this really do play a pivotal role in bringing together leaders and experts to address our most pressing global challenges. Yet, so often, the commitments that are made at these forums can stall once the spotlight fades. So we're going to be addressing this issue today. We're going to explore how to turn forums like this here in Davos into powerful catalysts for tangible, measurable impact in the real world. And we're going to examine how to strengthen accountability and ensure that international forums not only raise awareness, but also inspire meaningful change. So thank you all for joining us this morning, and let's get started. Your Highness, I'd like to start with you because, of course, we meet at a very critical moment for the world. The United States has just inaugurated President Trump for a second time, and of course, at home in the Middle East, we're also seeing a fragile ceasefire between Israel and Hamas play out after 15 months of war. So, Your Highness, can you comment on the impact of these twin events for Saudi Arabia to kick us off? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. Obviously, we are very happy to see a ceasefire come into place in Gaza. This is something that is long overdue. We should have had it months ago, not now. Too many people have died. Of course, now what's important is that this ceasefire is fully implemented and that we move into the following phases and that we get stability back. And of course, we have to keep an eye also on the developments in the West Bank and make sure that doesn't spiral out of control. Obviously, the election of a new administration in the US is always consequential. It's always impactful on the world. We've already seen a lot of decisions coming out of the Trump White House that will impact all of us. We've had experience with the Trump administration, and we have a good relationship with the US, and I'm sure we'll be able to build on that and work with the new administration to ensure not just stability in the region, but also cooperation. And I'd like to note that you started with asking about the ceasefire, and it was quite clear that the Trump administration, even before coming in, had an impact on getting that over the line. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do good things.
Your Highness, international cooperation is, of course, the topic of our discussion, and it is critical to ensure that that ceasefire holds. Are you optimistic that it will?
I am hopeful. I won't say optimistic, but I'm hopeful. And again, it's the responsibility of all of us in the region to work together to keep it on track.
So let's talk about the topic as well, because with that in mind, how critical would you say, Your Highness, are international forums like the World Economic Forum and elsewhere in creating meaningful engagement among governments, the private sector, and civil society to drive action on some of these critical global issues?
I mean, obviously, just having an opportunity for world leaders from the economic, political, non-profit, across the board, having an opportunity to meet in one place at the same time and interact is absolutely critical. I'm on a panel right now, but I'm going to say I actually think it's not the panels that are the most important. It's the opportunity to engage in one-on-one conversations or smaller groups in private, offline, often within people that you wouldn't normally have the opportunity to run into or engage with. So that's the most important thing. So from my perspective, what makes an event impactful is really the curation of the attendance rather than the panels.
And the bringing together of people to have these conversations. So thank you so much, Your Highness. I think I can go over to Akeem Steiner next. Akeem, I wanted to ask you as well, what's your view on this, given the UNDP's global purview? How do international forums accelerate knowledge sharing and collaboration among regions and sectors? And could you react and respond to what His Highness has just said?
Thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here with all of you at a moment in time that I think, as His Highness just pointed out, there are elections, and there are certain elections that also have, repercussions on a global stage. I think what we're entering into right now is an interesting moment where we will, on the one hand, test the boundaries, but also the limitations sometimes of these international platforms, because there's a great deal that hinges on this notion of what is international cooperation about. Is it about somebody else's interests? Is it about my interests? And I think that tension is going to be more pronounced over the next 1 or 2 years, because there is a much more, let's say, clearer articulation of national interests. There is, in the 21st century, there is no economy, there is no country that is an island, whether it is pandemic preparedness, new agendas emerging. I think part of what we see, whether it is the preparedness, whether it is dealing with cybercrime, cyber warfare, whether it is dealing with climate change or indeed poverty. The Nations Development Program, which is essentially a platform which countries cooperate, whether it is on, macroeconomic issue and inequality. We have seen how these tensions and pressures, whether it is on the access to technology, one of the fundamental questions I think that we have to ask ourselves is not only affect a particular part of the world, and we just spoke about the ceasefire in Gaza. I mean, the last 15 months have preoccupied the whole world. And I think in that sense, the institutions, the platforms we create, first of all, for engaging, as His Highness said, but also then for finding solutions and particularly building bridges between those countries that may have the technological, financial or human resources and those that do not. And that idea that in the 21st century, development is still something that brings us all together is really at the heart of my interpretation of why we actually have these international institutions and platforms.
Thank you, Hakeem. I wanted to bring it over to His Excellency Mohammed Al-Jadaan as well, because, of course, His Highness has spoken about the importance of peace and stability in the region. Could you please share your thoughts as well, Your Excellency, on what this means for Saudi Arabia's growth and economic outcomes in 2025?
Thank you very much, and thank you, everyone, for being here. Obviously, for any economic reform, for any economic activity for that matter, stability is absolutely key. And not stepping in His Highness's toes, but Saudi Arabia has really focused on de-escalating in the region with real actions over the last few years, and that paid off and will continue to do so. It is very critical that we bring more stability into the region, and it is very critical that we play a role model in our reform to actually encourage other countries in the region to focus on their economy and what matters for their people rather than hostilities and conflicts.
And Your Excellency, from your vantage point as well, what do you see as perhaps the biggest obstacle that hinders international forums from translating high-level visions into tangible outcomes? What's the disconnect?
Well, this is actually a question with a mine, Dan. I think actually international forums, multilateral institutions actually are effective. And despite this possibly perception of otherwise, I really believe the contrary. They operate in a very complex situations where they need to align, bring and build consensus among multiple nations, sometimes hundreds, 192 now, for example, in the IMF. And to build consensus among 192 is a very complex process. So you need to negotiate, you need to make sure that people settle within their own a system of governance and then try and be pragmatic in reaching solutions. But we have seen a lot of success. We should not really estimate the success that international organizations, multilateral institutions, international forums have delivered throughout the history of their existence. I mean, the IMF, for example, has been in existence for 80 years. Only, just to name few, in the last few years, they deployed $650 billion to support members of the IMF during a very difficult shocks in the world. And most of these are low-income countries who needed the support to be able actually to serve their nations. And I can go on and give a lot of examples. During COVID, the international forums came together, G20, the IMF, the World Bank, and came up with the debt service suspension initiative and then the common framework. That helped low-income countries deal with a shock that was very difficult and enabled them actually to support their people during the pandemic. And they could go on. And there were successes. Yes, there are delays, but these delays are not necessarily attributed to the forums or the institutions themselves. There are also individual nations that they need to go through their political process to reach agreements.
It's an excellent point, and I also think this is a great point to bring in Gita Gopinath as well, because Gita, this is something that you actively think about as well in your role at the IMF. Just reflecting on what His Excellency and His Highness have said, global collaboration is obviously very important in achieving economic outcomes, but when you assess the impact of the Trump administration and Trump 2.0, do you think global collaboration takes a step back if we see Trump advancing America first in his second term?
Firstly, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I just want to reinforce a point that was made, which is that countries work together primarily because it is in their self-interest to work together. And over again, we have seen that as being the glue that holds all of these multilateral institutions together, including the International Monetary Fund. And a reason why countries see it in their self-interest to work together, which has only gotten more important over time, is because the world has never been more economically integrated as it is now. So it is a very complex machinery with huge global supply chains weaving through multiple borders. And if you don't have global cooperation, it's going to be a very tricky thing. And I just want to also give thanks to Saudi Arabia for many things, including Mohammed is now chair of the International Monetary and Financial Committee at the IMF. And, through that leadership, we are seeing some very important reforms taking place and agreements being made at the International Monetary Fund in terms of helping low-income countries, in terms of reducing the cost of borrowing from the IMF. These are just a couple that we've had accomplished. So it does work, just to reinforce what Mohammed said, that it absolutely works. I mean, to your question, of course, I think there is what I fall back to, which is to say that it is in every country's interest to work together. We have multiple countries in the world that we work with on a daily basis. I mean, especially low-income countries, for example, that need debt restructuring. And when we are thinking about getting that done, the creditors are a wide range of countries. I mean, there are the Paris Club creditors that we have, the G7. But in addition, we have China, we have Saudi Arabia, we have India, all of them involved in this debt restructuring. So it's not possible to actually do this without taking a multilateral perspective.
Indeed, and Your Excellency Faisal Al-Ibrahim, I'll get you to react to this as well. You heard what His Highness said about efforts to foster regional peace and what His Excellency said about economic outcomes as well. Of course, Gita speaking to that too. So what would you say are the actions that are required now to ensure discussions at forums lead to measurable and tangible results for Saudi Arabia, for the region and for the world?
Thank you, Dan. I think before I answer that specifically, maybe take a step back. I think Saudi Arabia, pre-Vision 2030, has always been a constructive member of the global community, but focused on specific areas. I'd say maybe oil and gas, diplomacy, and foreign aid and assistance, with the kingdom being one of the top, if not the top, in ODA. But since Vision 2030, we started understanding more what we need to do for our own economy and society to unlock its potential. And that made us need to engage even more with the global community and multilateral platforms, but also bilaterally, to better address the needs that we have. So with that institutional capability, with that knowledge, came that ability to engage more meaningfully and constructively. And of course, with that, we understand what our partners need and we engage. Of course, we double down on multilateral platforms because we realize that they are, as His Excellency said, an effective tool. And we believe this tool will always be effective because it brings people together. It keeps global dialogue being fostered, regardless of the challenges, regardless of how the environment is changing. Keeping countries talking is very important. However, and I think like how many multilateral platforms are reforming on their own, we realized that there were things that can improve. And we started talking about these things more openly with our partners, with these multilateral platforms, to the point where the Kingdom's leadership in diplomacy or in these multilateral platforms have led to things such as His Excellency leading the IMFC, and of course, His Excellency's leadership. I'm sitting next to my two favorite ministers, so I have to comment on that. But what we also realized that the voice of the, I'd say, the countries that are not economic superpowers means a lot. And some are actually undergoing the reform internally and understanding better what they need and are becoming more meaningful contributors to this global dialogue, similar to what Saudi has gone through. And we realize with time that these interventions by multilateral platforms need to have measurable impact. So many times we sit and we over-align on something that is not worth aligning on, and sometimes really seeking the truth and seeking the right decision, even if there isn't more alignment on it, could be the best thing. So we shouldn't get lost in watered down consensus, if that makes sense. And this takes continuous debate and dialogue and discussion. Two, there's contexts and different backgrounds that need to be always addressed. So some countries have different contexts compared to others, and that I think is something important for us to continue keeping in mind. And thirdly, I think innovation. We need to continue to innovate, involve the private sector, keep engaging other tools to make sure that we can be even more impactful and, I'd say, our work to travel even longer.
I think it's a really good point, and you and I have spoken a lot in the past about the role of the private sector, and I want you to expand on that as well, because what we've seen in the Kingdom over the last few years is significant private sector investment, of course, huge government sector investment as well, to transform this economy, to transform this society, continue to build out the economic growth picture, and also advance Saudi Arabia's overall Vision 2030 goal. So can you speak a little bit more about the importance of engaging the private sector in this collaborative effort to achieve outcomes?
So I'd say maybe if you look at Vision 2030, the objective is for the economy to detach itself from having to rely on oil inflows, but also for a source of growth to expand. And the best way to do that is obviously you intervene as a government, but the fastest, most efficient way in the long term is to create the space for the private sector to grow more dynamically. You can regulate, you can guide, you can whatnot. And with time, the importance of public-private sector participation, privatization, the value of that becomes even more important. You get access to smarter capital, more capital, access to efficiency, access to engagement of a wider community than what is already incumbent in your country, but also access to innovative solutions. If you only look at infrastructure, you'll see that the role of private capital, and we're seeing, I'd say, capital markets shift today more towards infrastructure and private capital and private debt or credit. You'll see that there's room for you to also extend further what you're able to typically fund and have more engagement from more constituents and multiply the impact.
Geeta, can you speak to that as well, and how the fund interweaves government sector, the private sector, and NGOs as well to achieve outcomes?
I mean, the IMF as an institution, I mean, one of the things we focus on is to ensure that you have the ecosystem for the private sector to play a central role in your economy. And there are lots of good reasons for that, including that's where innovation happens, and that's where the the sources, the new forms of growth come from. At this point, there's another reason why that's even more important, because many governments around the world have very high levels of debt, and they really don't have the space to be able to use their own public purse to undertake the kinds of investments that are needed. So encouraging the private sector is absolutely critical. I mean, what it takes and what we've seen around the world is, first, it's very important to have a stable macroeconomic environment. So if you keep your inflation in control, your exchange rate, behaving as well as possible, a sound fiscal situation, all of that is very encouraging. It's a good piece of the environment that's needed for the private sector. But in addition to that, of course, making sure that you have deep enough capital markets to bring money to who needs the financing, that you have the public infrastructure, that's also critical, and your laws and institutions that help the private markets thrive.
Before I bring it back over to His Excellency and His Highness here, I also wanted to go back over to Akeem, because it's been really interesting to see in the last couple of years the World Economic Forum focusing heavily on this issue of collaboration. And it published a report last year, 2024, that said global collaboration actually flatlined. And what we're seeing now is stagnation when it comes to global collaboration. So could you shed light on how resource mobilization, financial, technical, and human factor into some of these limitations, and why we might be seeing this disconnect?
I think in part it has a lot to do with false dichotomies. I think the first one is public versus private sector. And we've spent the last 40 years in the development arena globally debating whether it's the state that provides the solutions of the great development. Is it the market? Is it the private sector? I think every successful economy ultimately demonstrates that a government that is providing stability, incentives, regulatory frameworks actually also enables markets to thrive. Private capital is the dominant, let's say, fiscal resource we have in the world. So I think there's very little debate about it. But we know that capital is very fickle. Capital is also very selfish. And we can't, in a sense, ignore the fact that we have a continent such as Africa today, where you have hundreds of millions of people who don't even have access to electricity yet. And yet, if you look at the capital flows, the investments, the energy companies, they're not investing there. So we need to correct for that. And I think the second is a very narrow view that national interest versus a shared interest is somehow a contradiction. And I think, again, what we have seen a lot over the last few years is the polarization within countries. Domestic politics is increasingly narrowing the lens through which people are able to see that national interest is not just what do I extract from an international community, but rather what do I invest in order to create that international community's ability to act, whether it is jumping into the digital economy, whether it is the new frontiers of AI. We have a deep interest in being able to invest in one another so that we don't create a world where perhaps 60–70% of the world's population will simply be left behind, while some put in the fourth gear when it comes to application of such technologies. So I think we have to recognize we're going through a particularly complex moment in history that I think is polarizing geopolitically because of the shifts that are happening. But perhaps the greatest Achilles heel is the discourse at national level. If we allow this notion to continue that it is only the national interest in the narrow sense that will define our greatest advantage, I think we're heading into some very troubled waters.
Really fascinating. We have about 10 minutes left, so I also wanted to open to the floor to see if there was anyone who also had a question to share or contribute. If you do, we have some microphones around that we can bring to you and give you the opportunity to ask our expert panel some questions. But as we get set up for that, I also wanted to move it back over to His Excellency Mohammed Al-Judaan here, because perhaps you can react to what Akeem has just said. And as chair of IMFC, what's your vision? What is your overall goal for achieving collaboration on the global stage?
Thank you again. There are multiple areas, I think. I mean, the IMF has existed for the last 8 years, and throughout has evolved, and without that they will become irrelevant. But they really evolved and continue to be very relevant. And it's about time that the IMF itself looks at what really needs to be done to continue to be relevant. And one of them is becoming the fund for the future. what really the next stage of the fund is going to be. How can we improve the governance and the institutional setup? And we have just added the 25th chair into the board for Sub-Saharan Africa, which really increases the representation of these economies who are really, really in need. Gita mentioned earlier that we also looked at what else do we need in terms of making it easier for countries to get support when they need it, but also making sure that there is an incentive for them to keep up with the reforms. So adjusted the surcharges and the charges. Quota is another area where we needed to make sure that the fund is ready for the next international shock. And the fund plays an incredible role in financial stability, and we need to make sure that it has the strength and the resources that it will be able to support the world when needed.
Before I move over to His Highness, does anyone have any questions in the room? Perhaps over on this side. Thank you. Please introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name is Konstantin. I'm running an investment firm out of Germany. So the question is for the panel. The question is on the relevancy of United Nations and, to your point, on watered down solutions and resolutions. We often hear United Nations has expressed concerns over, which obviously everybody has a concern. So the question is, do you think the UN needs a reform, or do we need other forums to tackle these things more effectively?
Your Highness, maybe you can speak to that first. The question was about the relevance of the United Nations and whether or not we need to see reform in that arena.
Yeah, I mean, it remains incredibly relevant because it's the only place where nation states can come on an equal basis, except for the permanent five, to actually try to work out conflicts and issues. However, clearly over the last years, Gaza being a key case in point, but other conflicts as well, it has shown that it needs to be reformed. And we know the Kingdom, among other nations, have constantly asked for and called for reform, whether it's reform of the Security Council, reform of the veto, but reform of mechanisms in general under which the United Nations conducts its business. Because, again, the founding principle of the United Nations was that all nations are equal. But clearly, in reality, that is not the case. And we do need to work to actually bring that principle to the fore, and that will need a reform process. But I think the reality is the United Nations is the only forum that we have, and trying to build in a replacement forum would be so enormously complex, it would not be able to reach any form of consensus, that the focus should be on reforming, improving the mechanism that we have, which is the United Nations. And if you read the United Nations Charter, I think the building blocks are there. It's just that we need to maybe reconnect ourselves with the founding principles of the UN.
Your Highness, can I follow up on that as well? And of course, Your Excellency, jump in here too. But are there specific failures you've seen at the UN through the course of 2024 that you could speak to? And what are the necessary reforms in order to address those failures?
I mean, the most blatant and glaring one, certainly for us in the Middle East, is the inability to reach any resolutions on Gaza, on a ceasefire in Gaza. The fact that it became controversial for the United Nations Security Council to issue a resolution calling for a ceasefire was incredibly frustrating for all of us. The fact that we had to reach 60,000 dead, or even 100,000 dead in Gaza before we got to a ceasefire, and in the end it happened not because of the United Nations stepping in, but rather because certain countries mediated among the warring parties. So that obviously is for us a glaring failure of certainly the security mechanisms of the United Nations. I think the United Nations, on the other hand, for instance, has done very successful work in the developmental field. The development agencies are doing excellent work. That said, The mechanisms of providing funding for them are also constantly at risk, are also constantly under pressure. The way these resources are distributed are also not always ideal. So there's a lot more that can be done.
Indeed. Your Excellency, can you speak to that too?
Just a follow-up. I think in addition to the reform of the multilateral institutions platforms, we need to invest as a community in promoting and supporting and pushing the reform of public sectors in different countries. And public sectors in different countries, it's not easy for everyone to just wake up and decide to reform, but if you just prioritize it and invest in it. In the Kingdom today, even in its ODA or in support of some countries, is leveraging multilateral platforms to push even more reform. And as His Excellency mentioned, associating the support with the reform and kind of linking it together, because ultimately you want sustainable public sector capability. And there's a gap globally between what the public sector can do today and what the potential for the public sector to do is. In the Kingdom, we're realizing the value of engaging in these multilateral platforms because we can learn from it, because we can share so that other countries, we're not an OECD member, but we're heavily engaged with the OECD in many aspects. We're here in Davos to engage, have a delegation to engage with leaders from around the world, from all sectors, to continue the discussion, sharing what we're learning, but also being challenged and trying to understand how we can do things better.
I think we might have time for one more question in the room. Would anyone else like to ask our panel a question? In the front here.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to build on that issue of the United Nations, but more in the domain of multilateralism. And what are your concrete hopes or expectations from an organization like the BRICS, given the various different economies that are part of this bloc now?
We are not yet members of BRICS, as most of you will know, that we have been invited to join, and we haven't made a final determination as to that. We're still studying it within our own system. From our perspective, whether it's BRICS, whether it's any other multilateral fora, and there are a plethora of them, the main, I think, focus for us, or the main interest for us, is that they be committed to improving the global situation for all, that they are not focused on narrow political or interest-based agendas. And, you know, we have had success with that in some cases, and some organizations have been more successful than others. And I think from our perspective, any multilateral organization, whether we are members of it or not, should focus on delivering for the greater good. And I would hope that that would be the guiding light for all of us.
How soon before we get a determination on BRICS?
I don't have a time frame.
Maybe one more question in the room, if anyone else would like to ask. Over this side.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question. You know, the world is facing, you know, a new sense of fragmentation. We are talking about trade wars that can have unintended consequences like currency wars. So this is the core why the IMF was created, you know, to prevent, you know, currency instability and trade wars. So what are going to do? What should be the policy responses for countries around the world about this new framework? Thank you.
So we are certainly in a world which is quite different from a time when everybody agreed that unfettered global integration was a good thing. And there are some good reasons why countries are reassessing it, because there is, you know, after the pandemic, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there are very important national security concerns that have come up. There is the question of resilience of your supply chain. And so, you know, while in the past we were all hyper-focused on efficiency, I think there is now, a legitimate call to say, well, we also need to focus on resilience. Now, the concern, of course, is that you end up going down a slippery slope and you end up being entirely protectionist. To your question about how is it that we can do this better, I think the first thing we have to do is recognize that the system, the world trading system, has its deficiencies. And is there a way that we can assure countries that there is more of a level playing field, at least the countries that we can all work with? Can we have a more level playing field in here? And how do we make sure that we don't have a race to the bottom in terms of subsidies and industrial policies and so on? And so one example I would give you is, there was a time in the 1980s when the world was in conflict over agricultural support policies, where it was not industry and manufacturing, but it was back then it was agriculture, and the fact that all governments were trying to support their farmers, and 30% of the revenues earned by agriculture were basically subsidies from the governments. And the way that got solved was basically finance ministers of the world came together and said, this is very costly for us, and it's a slippery slope we're going down. So can we come together and first of all have an agreement on what's a reasonable amount to support? How do we determine this carefully? And that worked, and you had an agreement on agriculture through the WTO. So I think that has to evolve. We don't have anything similar for industrial policies, for the new generation of companies that exist. We need to adapt to that, and so we do need such mechanisms to work. Now, that said, I think none of this is a silver bullet. One thing is not going to solve all the problems. And one of the virtues of multilateral fora is it's a trust-building process. And it can feel painfully slow for large periods of time. But then when crisis comes together, that's when all that trust that you've built up, in that capital that you've built up, gets deployed. And that happened during the great financial crisis, when countries agreed to spend, to deploy $4 trillion to help stimulate the world economy. It happened during the pandemic, and Saudi Arabia's very critical role in setting up the common framework to help with debt restructuring. So that happens. So I think we should not leave this room thinking that now every meeting is going to be very consequential. I suspect there will be many meetings that feel like watching the grass grow. But that's a very important input into having good global action when the world is in a tough spot.
Well said. And Your Highness, I think I'll give you the final word here. Would you like to make some final comments? And to Geeta's point, how do we sustain momentum when it comes to international collaboration? And just finally also, what would you say is the biggest risk in 2025 as you assess the outlook for international collaboration, as we look at what's happening in the United States, as you assess what's happening around the world? What keeps you awake at night?
We don't have enough time for the things that keep me awake at night. But anyway, just building on, again, what Geeta said, and because she did mention a couple of very important success stories. And that tells you that we can actually work together when we put our minds to it. And when we prioritize the greater good over narrow interests, we can work towards something that delivers for all of us. And the fact that we have done that in the past gives me the confidence that we will continue to do it, and we will do it in the future. And although we will face difficult challenges this year and in years to come, I have to hope, and I certainly know that the Kingdom will be part of that, but I have to hope that we will all, as the global community, focus on working together, on solving problems, not on agreeing on everything, because we're never going to agree on everything. But you don't need to agree on everything in order to actually come to a common approach to problem solving. You can work through that, and again, the couple of cases that Geeta mentioned, and there are others in the similar vein, prove that that's the case. So let's focus on problem solving rather than on arguing.
Indeed, and I think that's a very nice way to conclude our conversation. This has been a fantastic session. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation over breakfast. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank my guests, His Highness, Their Excellencies Geeta and Akeem. Thank you all again.